you're back with us live at Devex World, where I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Swift-Morgan, a director at Chemonics. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
So you're somewhat of a governance expert and have worked with Chemonics in implementing projects in a multitude of different places. And I'm wondering, how much do you think the political stability and context of a country really feeds into the impact of the development work?
Sure, I think we know now that politics matters a lot. I like to use the example of right here in Washington, D.C. If you think about the healthcare reform debates, think about that for a minute. What was it that really drove that debate? Was it only a use of good data and trying to find like the best technical options for how to do healthcare for most Americans and get the best benefit out of it, maybe with a little bit of consultation on the side? I mean, the reality is that was deeply, deeply political process. It wasn't just based on good data and some participatory processes. And I think what's interesting is that those of us who are development practitioners from the West, from the North, we sometimes forget about that from our own contexts. And we go to different countries and either we forget that politics is such an important part of our own reform processes at home, or we just want to ignore it, or we think that if we shouldn't be involved, and we don't realize how deeply inherently political even foreign assistance is, and that whether we like it or not, politics is part of the issue. And so we try often to forget that it's there, ignore it, and we go about trying to promote reform processes as if the politics are not there. And change makers in the United States trying to bring about reforms here would never try to attempt doing that without politics. So we know that they're there, and it's important then to contend with politics and to find ways of working through the local systems. So I can give you an example. Recently, I was working in Jordan, where Chemonics has a project there with USAID, working on municipalities and decentralization. Decentralization, typically, through international development projects, has been treated very technocratically. That there's a set of different interventions we can do, there's training we can do about how a system is decentralized, how more responsibility is now at the local level. But decentralization is inherently a deeply political process. The power is changing between different parties. And even if we're coming at it through a training program, the very choice of who we're training, in what context, who was invited, who had decision-making over the content, everything we do, whether we think it's political or not, has a link to different people's interests, what they're trying to get at, where their incentives are, and the power relations between different actors in that context.
So would you say that even if the funding's there, the quality of programming is technically very high, if there isn't some kind of relationship there with the local government or some kind of work addressing the politics of that country, then potentially success can be undermined?
Yeah, no, I think it can. The example, there are many, many different examples that we can think about. There's this idea that the politics really can ultimately, end of the day, make or break a reform. So we want to get to smaller bets. We don't want to take a $70 million project, for instance, and say at the very beginning that we know exactly what's going to happen at the end of that a typical 5-year program process for like a USAID project. Instead, we need to do deep understanding of what that context is. So in a place like Afghanistan, this morning we had the First Lady from Afghanistan who was speaking here at Devex, Rula Ghani, and she gave an example of a representative for an aid agency that came to see her recently. And the example she said was, he came in and said, "I need your help. We've been feeling like there's a lot of pushback in the field when we go out there and we talk to people." And her thing was, well, you know what? That's actually people who have found their voice, who know what they want to get at. And you're not necessarily listening to them, and you're not following where the different interests lie in this particular community. The community may feel more comfortable with one organization over another. And so if we don't take those kinds of things into account, then no matter how hard we're trying to hammer at something, we may just not be breaking through.
So how can we factor that into our work from the get-go?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think it starts at many levels. So there is a growing body of evidence and of discussion around what we call thinking and working politically. This has started a lot by some work that's been funded by DFID. There is now a secretariat in England for the Thinking and Working Politically, or TWP, community of practice. And one thing that we've learned is that there's a spectrum to this. So before a development project even begins, one of the first questions to ask is a development project even the answer, right? I mean, there are many ways to serve development goals. Today we were talking about trade being an answer. So is it necessarily even a project in sort of the classic format? Governments that are looking to help other governments develop when we're trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The first question is, in this particular context, is a project-based approach even the most politically expedient? Or is there something else we could be doing with our funding? Or is funding not even the answer? So that the question starts at that stage before you even get into development projects. Once you've made a decision to go forward with funding, then again, there's a question. Does that go straight to the government? Is it a context in which really we should be directly funding? And in some contexts, that's true. Should we be directly funding local organizations? I mean, this is not something you would necessarily hear from a development implementer. But if we're serious about working ourselves out of a job, then it's the people who are in these contexts who know the best about themselves. We heard an example earlier today about an organization in Uganda. They have everything they need. They're just not seen as a traditional development partner. But who better, right, to be doing this? So that's a political decision even at that level. Then, if you have made a decision to create a development project as we know them, give money out to through contracts to different American implementing organizations, then the question is, how is that contract designed? And how much work went in ahead of time at the funder level to understand the context before a grant or contract is even made? Has that deep contextual understanding been captured in that design so that from the very beginning it's politically savvy, it's understanding that people have different interests, and that's what's driving people's behavior. So, it goes all the way from the very beginning at that level. And then once you have a contract, you have to come at it with a humbleness of saying, we actually don't know all the answers. And if it's an outside agency, you're necessarily an outsider to this context. So you have to take the time really to understand things before plunging in.
And is this an approach that you at Chemonics have been implementing into your projects across the board?
Well, it's something that we're starting to do more of. We kind of come to a realization that thinking and working politically again is so incredibly important that we're conscious of the fact that an organization, a company as large as Chemonics, has the responsibility to be aware of these issues, and that also we have ability to make quite a large impact with the number of projects that we have and the number of countries that we're working in. So yes, we're starting. We have put together some materials that different projects can work using political economy analysis. But PEA, political economy analysis, is an old tool. It's been around for at least a couple decades. More and more you see it coming out in USAID projects. You would see it classically in different projects for a long time. But one thing we're trying to get folks to understand is that doing a single political economy analysis, a study, isn't sufficient. It's really a mentality about thinking and working politically. It has to go deeper than a single study that may just stay on the shelf. I have a story to tell actually about a colleague, a fellow researcher once in Benin. We were out to dinner one night having beers after a long day, right? And that's part of thinking working politically, is creating the informal space to have a real conversation with someone. And a lot of interesting things had come out of our consultations that day. things that normally people wouldn't write in reports, right? In terms of, oh, well, there's this person in ministry that has this particular interest, and I could see that if we did this intervention, that might not work because his interest is not aligned, right? And I just stepped back for a minute and I asked him, I said, how many times has it happened to you? And I was a researcher in Benin, from Benin, that very enthusiastic development agencies and workers come in with these great ideas, and you're just sitting there thinking, that's never gonna work, but I'm gonna go ahead because maybe you're in the ministry and you're not gonna say no to that money, right? Or because you have no idea how to explain to this Westerner, this person who's not from there, what the real story is about what's going on. Or you're afraid that if you were to try to explain, they wouldn't get it or they don't want to hear it. So I asked him, how often does that happen? And he looked at me over his beer and he said, all the time. All the time. You know, and it was just one of these moments where, I mean, how often do we do that? And with how much money? So it's a paradigm shift. In the sense, it seems so obvious. Politics are always there, you know, doing good development. Any good development worker is sort of aware of that at some level. But it has to be purposeful, and we have to understand just how deep that runs.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's great. Thank you very much for watching.